Carly Ziter is here from Concordia. She is a real kind of pioneer in thinking about urbanization and environment in industrial and urban spaces, particularly forestry, a topic that I know is central to this research studio as well. Her work uses fieldwork, advanced sensor data, and synthesis approaches to ask how landscape structure, land use history, and biodiversity interact to impact multiple ecosystem services. And she runs quite an extensive lab at Concordia on this subject, that really looks at rethinking our ideas of landscape, rethinking ideas of how we want to maintain and conserve environments in highly disrupted spaces. She has an incredible number of publications. I can't even begin to name all of them here. I have to say, has also been really inspiring to me, and conversations with her about languages of like resilience and thinking about how we want to kind of think about what conservation and what we wish to conserve or not conserve when we're thinking about ecosystems. She's also a real pioneer in doing kind of community-based science projects by getting people to do like a lot of citizen science and data gathering on trees inside neighborhoods in Montreal. So she's been really rethinking tree management, environmental management in urban spaces in a manner that I think will also speak to this question that we're dealing with in this research studio concerning these sort of extraction facilities that are located right near cities, and more generally thinking about how we wish to conserve or reclaim kind of disturbed, or not even just, I don't know how you want to think. Carly has a way more sophisticated model of thinking about environmental change. I think in general, that's a really important topic, is to think about environmental change and how we understand it and how we wish to design for it.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. I will be speaking in English today. I speak bad French, but I speak some French. So feel free to, pose ton question en français aussi. Okay, let's see if I can share my screen here. And are you seeing my presenter view, or are you seeing the right thing?
We're seeing the right
Good,
thing.
perfect. Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit about kind of restoring or conserving or reclaiming, to what and for who. So how the science of ecology can inform some of these interdisciplinary practices and questions that you are all grappling with in your work. And I'll just introduce myself a little bit first. So I primarily am a field ecologist. So I got my start in research and really developed my love for ecology working as an undergrad in the field, like collecting seeds and measuring trees and catching sharks and doing all of these, having all of these incredible experiences with the natural world in aquatic and terrestrial systems. My master's I did here in Quebec, I measured like 11,000 trees throughout the Montérégie region to understand our forests. But throughout my PhD, I really shifted. And now I and my students kind of transition to working in sites that maybe look a little more familiar to a lot of you, where I traded some of these more wild or working landscapes for what I like to call living landscapes, places that we actually live and work and play, that kind of make up our cities and our towns. And these are obviously systems that have been really heavily modified by people. You might call them disturbed, you might call them novel. There's lots of different terms we can use for these kinds of systems, but they have certainly been drastically changed. And continue to be changed based on the management decisions that we make and based on what we value for these spaces. So I run a lab at Concordia. I think I am missing some people here in this photo, but I have lots of really excellent students. And so some of the work that I'll talk about is work that they are really doing, not so much me. And within this context, what my students and I are really interested in is how can we better understand and ultimately, manage these green spaces in our city to both sustain and enhance biodiversity conservation and ecosystem service provision. And when I say green space, I mean that word, really broadly, from like a park to a vacant lot to an active restoration site to your backyard. If it's growing, I'm interested in it, basically. And the two words I really want to highlight here that kind of frame a lot of my research are biodiversity conservation and ecosystem service provision. And so, ecosystem services, which are sometimes referred to as nature's benefits, nature's contributions to people, nature's gifts, are really about drawing attention to the ways that people depend on the environment. So there's a lot of different terminology around this, some of it a little bit more contentious, but at the heart of it, nature's benefits are really the basis for human lives and economies. We all rely on nature to live healthier, safer, richer lives, whether we kind of acknowledge that in our day to day life or not. And another really important part of this concept is that humans are really instrumental in mediating the provision of these kinds of services, through management, through intervention. So most of these benefits don't just kind of magically flow from nature to us without any intervention. People have, always been involved in managing the landscapes around them. And these can include things that we actually like use or extract from ecosystems. It could be timber, it could be food, fuel, fiber. It can include the ways we benefit by the regulation of processes, so wetlands through the province store carbon, reduce flooding, control erosion. Healthy, intact ecosystems can reduce disease. Can reduce pandemics. Many of our ecosystems support pollination, for example. And ecosystem services, we derive value from nature in all kinds of kind of intangible ways. So, we enjoy a hike or a paddle or a run along the canal or walking through a really beautifully landscaped or designed garden that's providing us aesthetic value. And so an ecosystem services framework can encompass these kinds of cultural values too. And I'm going to come back later to this concept of value and kind of how important that is and how we think about this. Um, and this is a really interdisciplinary field. So a lot of people have heard this term in an economic sense, like trying to put a money value on nature. Um, you could think of it through a more of a social science sense of who has access to these kinds of benefits, who doesn't. The work that I do with my lab really focuses on the ecology, the actual kind of biophysical processes that underlie how and where these benefits are produced on the landscape. And we'll come back to that biophysical aspect as well. But for now, ecosystem services is a framework for the way that we benefit or derive value from the nature that surrounds us. Biodiversity, I'll be much briefer here, is really just referring to the variability among living organisms. So a really simple measure we use is the number of species. We'll say, we have 10 species here or 100 species or 1,000 species, but there are all kinds of ways you can measure biodiversity. You can talk about genetic diversity. Are all of the plants coming from the same genetic stock? Are they clones of each other? You could talk about functional diversity. When we're in a forest system, you might talk about trees that have very different functional traits. Are they tall? Are they dense? Are they deciduous trees or coniferous trees? Um, Basically, it really comes down to, is there variability in the living aspects of your system? And so another maybe slightly oversimplified way of looking at the work that I do in my lab is that cities, or really the people within them, need nature. So they need these benefits we get from natural systems. And in our lab, we try and actually measure what some of those benefits are. So we might go out and measure aspects of our urban forest, think about how can we sustain and enhance our urban forests to reduce pollution or reduce temperature or control flooding. We also think a lot in our group about that intersection of built and natural environments. And so, what is the influence of something like densification or the way that we build our cities on people's access to these environmental benefits? Um, on the other hand, so I think this one makes a lot of sense to people, right? Cities need nature. You live in a city, you probably appreciate having a park nearby or having street trees. But nature also needs cities. And so the way that we build and we manage our cities, because urban areas are so ubiquitous on the landscape, has really critical consequences for all of the other, species that live here. All of our kind of non-human neighbors rely on us to manage our cities in a way that can support them. And so we think about pollinators in our group, for example. So how do the ways that we manage green spaces support our wild pollinator diversity? Um, how do practices like beekeeping, for example, which is an agricultural practice, influence our wild pollinator species? We have over 170 species of bees in Montreal alone. Just as an example, when I'm talking about biodiversity, these species we might not notice. And we think about ecological landscaping as well, which I'm sure relates to several of your work, where, what are the best practices if you want a wildlife friendly garden? What should we be planting? How should we be managing those spaces? And of course, these two concepts are sometimes related. Managing for more biodiversity might give us more of these benefits, but it's not always quite that simple. We really want them to go together, but they don't necessarily. And that's a really kind of active area of research in my field is how does biodiversity influence kind of the outputs of these ecological systems? So what does this kind of work have to do with you and what we're talking about today? So when I originally spoke with Orit, she mentioned that you were trying to really think about, think in critical ways about the environment, how we should be approaching the future of this planet, these big issues of technology and reclamation. And I was like, well, I study trees and cities. Like, what does this have to do with that? And I think, after thinking about it, fundamentally, as an urban ecologist, what I think about, what I try to do in my work is what do we value about nature and how can we actually measure those values? And I think that idea of how we measure and assess what we value is really critical to these fields of restoration and reclamation and envisioning our future landscapes as well. Um, and so one way that my perspective maybe overlaps with these questions that you're thinking about with reclamation and about visioning the future is the way that these spaces intersect with our values and our society. Um, and this idea of what we value about nature and who gets to decide what we value about nature is something that I think is really critical to the process of reclamation or restoration. And so I pulled out a quote here from one of the articles that I had shared with Alessandra that was an essay from Leon Hannigan, who's a restoration ecologist, but who also thinks a lot about art and some of these other fields. And he talks about restoration as the attempt, sometimes breathtakingly successful and sometimes less so, to make nature whole. And I have an image here of Curtis Prairie, which is from the UW-Madison Arboretum that he's referencing. And uh, while I am not actually a restoration ecologist, I did train at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I spent an awful lot of time in this prairie and, thinking about this space. And this is thought to be one of the first kind of attempts at prairie restoration by settlers in Wisconsin, or in North America. And so I really appreciated this quote to kind of bring me back to this place I spent a lot of time. And this quote from the same essay is maybe a little bit more relevant to our conversation today, where one of the questions that ecologists, that kind of natural scientists have really wrestled with is this idea of like the right thing or right time to restore to. And so if we're going to restore a landscape, if we're going to envision our future landscape, we've often had this idea stuck in our head that like, well, we have to put it back to a particular thing or a particular point in time, that, somehow we're like faking or we're doing it wrong if we don't hit this particular benchmark. And I think our perspectives on this are changing. I think certainly our perspectives are changing and need to be changing as we think more about reconciliation ecology and more about the history of our landscapes that, have been managed, for example, by indigenous communities long before we came in and started managing things. Um, but I think before we ask these questions about what do we restore to, we need to think about why we're trying to reclaim or restore a landscape. So who are we doing it for? What are the values we're trying to align with? Whose voices do we prioritize in these decisions? And often natural scientists or kind of hard scientists like to try and distance themselves from this discussion around value. Or like, well, we're just putting it back to this particular state. But implicitly in doing that, we're making a value judgment on what the right kind of ecosystem is. Another kind of framing device that I find useful in thinking through this is this paper from the late Georgina Mace, who is really a kind of leading voice in conservation ecology, who outlined this kind of timeline, relatively short timeline, that we've tended to think about nature and conservation as ecologists, where we've moved from this idea of really like nature for itself, where we, would wall off these protected areas, often in ways that really actively and violently, displaced people who lived in those areas, to say, well, this is a spot for nature. And we kind of continued on that, like, well, nature is separate from people. We need to think about restoration and reclamation and nature as separate from our, human concerns. And we've now kind of added, it's not so much a transition as adding new perspectives here, where we've added these ideas of, nature for people, some of that ecosystem service lens, and then moving that forward even more to how do we think about people and nature together? And that requires, a much more interdisciplinary lens. There are obviously many more ways to capture the relationships between people and nature than in this figure. And I think really missing in this particular figure is this critical role of traditional ecological knowledge or community knowledge in conserving nature, which is something that ecologists have a long way to go still, I think, in reconciling and in incorporating into our work. But I think it does illustrate that we've started to move from this idea that, okay, we just have to put things back the way they were at some point in time, to this idea of managing nature in a way that benefits, both people and our kind of non-human neighbors and other species. So how do we do that then? Like if we're looking at a site and we decide, well, we want to restore or reclaim or design a green space, whether it's in a city or, it's in some other area for nature and people, where do we actually start? And this is a really hard question, right? And this brings me back to this idea of ecosystem services, which to me are one example of a tool that we can use in these kinds of conversations. And I'll be, forthright here that not everyone agrees with me. So much like people describing restoration as kind of fake nature, lots of people don't like the idea of ecosystem services. They say, well, it's just a license to trash nature, or it's too anthropocentric, it's too capitalist, it's too rooted in, economics. And I think this kind of knee-jerk reaction we have against this concept comes from this idea or this misperception that the whole concept is just about like monetizing natural world. Like we're just trying to put dollar values on things. And that's really not true. And that's part of why some of the language around this, I think, is shifting to talking about these as nature's benefits or nature's contributions to people, because this term ecosystem services makes people think of money. But really, a better way to think about this is that this is a communications framework, and it can encompass many kinds of value systems. So you can Think about economic valuation, certainly, and this is just from a government toolkit on ecosystem services. But you can also think about kind of sociocultural valuation. Um, if I were to put the rest of this quote here, it talks as well about relational values. And so this idea of encompassing people's relationship with nature, and those relational values can have really important implications for ecosystem service decision making, and are particularly important when we're considering, using an ecosystem service framework in conjunction with, other ways of knowing, with traditional knowledge or community knowledge. But no matter how you value something, whether you value it with money, whether you're trying to put a social or a cultural value, uh, you usually need to measure it in some way. So if you want to quantify a value, you need some understanding of its quantity, of its quality, and often that will come from some kind of biophysical assessment. And so that is the kind of work that I do, is actually trying to put measurements on nature. And I could have talked like the whole 25 minutes just about this and how we choose biophysical indicators, which probably would have been, less interesting, which is why I didn't do it. But you can ask me questions. And so, for example, if we want to understand temperature regulation, one way that I have done this is through sensor-based measurements. So actually, building sensor equipment, going out, measuring the temperature in areas with different amounts and types of vegetation, which will let us say, how much tree cover we need to reduce the temperature, or which kinds of vegetation we should plant. If we want to understand pollination, to really do that well, we might have to go out into the field and actually measure like how much pollen is being deposited by bees on those flowers, and then go back and measure the size and shape of that fruit. And so a postdoctoral researcher in my lab has done just this and shown that having more diverse wild bee species gives you better strawberries. Um, and if we're thinking about something like climate regulation and we want to know about carbon storage, we can actually go out and, measure the size and species of trees, and then use models we've developed to understand how much carbon is stored. You'll see here that my student Kaylee is measuring this tree with a string. That's generally not how we do this as ecologists, but this is from a project that was a community science effort. And so we wanted people to actually go out and measure their own trees in their own yards and send us that data so we could understand these biophysical indicators, not just in public green spaces, but on people's own properties on private land. And, most people have string. And so that's what we did. And so it really, I know that you think a lot about technology in your group, and these biophysical indicators can really span a range from, very simple like string and duct tape, all the way through to sensor networks, remote sensing, Internet of Things. We're increasingly moving towards more technological measures uh, of nature, which I think is an interesting challenge and an interesting discussion to have about whether we're at a point where we can do these things through technology rather than like boots on the ground measurements. And so for the last few minutes, I'm going to circle back around to this idea of biodiversity, and that a green space is not a green space. And so I think one of the most important lessons we have from ecology in thinking about how to reclaim or restore or manage these really modified spaces is, and all these, thousands of biophysical measurements we have of nature, is that all green spaces are not created equal. So I think sometimes we have this impression that if something is green and it's lush and it's beautiful, we've kind of restored it. We've hit a target of putting this back to nature. But we really need to consider aspects of biodiversity, of that variability, of that space. And so one reason is that different kinds of organisms give us different benefits. So as an ecologist, I would call this a functional trait, but really you can think of this, let's say you're going to plant a tree or you're designing a garden. That garden will have a tree in it. The things that tree will give us really differ. So I might have a beautiful, big, tall elm tree that's going to give me shade. It's going to reduce the temperature. It's going to store carbon. I might have a nice little serviceberry, and that is going to attract birds to my garden. I can make Saskatoon berry pie. It flowers, it's beautiful. It's not going to give me that same kind of shade and temperature regulation. So this is a really simple example, but you can imagine how all of these little design or aesthetic or personal choice decisions we make scale up as we start adding, more green spaces, more yards, more sites to the landscape. And my friend and colleague Desiree Narango, who does really excellent work on plant choice, has done some really interesting studies on this, connecting the things we plant to ultimately to birds, because she's interested in birds. But birds need food. So if you want a yard that attracts birds, you need to provide them, a bird food buffet, which means caterpillars, because birds, many of them, like to eat caterpillars. Most caterpillars eat a specific plant. And so they went through data on insects and what they ate across the entire US and found that just a few plants, few genera of plants support more caterpillar diversity, which support more birds. So having these kind of keystone plants in your landscape, in your design, really matters for kind of the functioning of that whole system, which matters for the ways that we connect with that space. Um, and many of these important plants are native species, so species that are indigenous, are local to our landscapes, are often the better choice for supporting, more wildlife. And so this was an example from people's yards. And if your yard has mostly native plants, you can support, breeding bird populations. Once you move towards mostly non-native plants, more horticultural species, you start losing these species that have, used our landscape and lived in our landscapes for a very long time. Biodiversity can also provide resilience. And so resilience is a word that gets used to mean many different things in many different contexts. But in the ecological context, when I say resilience, I mean, can our system, keep functioning the way we expect it to function? So we have a really nice stand of trees here. Like, this is a nice street. I'd like to live on this street. It's probably providing lots of nice benefits to the people who live here. And this is that same street 3 years later, and every tree is dead. And this is because every tree was an ash tree. It was the same species. And we had the invasive ash borer. So this is from Ohio, but it very well could be from Montreal. It's the same problem. We've had an invasive insect, or an example of, a global change, come in. And now we've gone from this beautiful landscape providing us many benefits to a street of dead trees. And so if you had had more diversity among these species, we would have ended up with a system that was able to kind of sustain its function, sustain its benefits for longer. And this is something we do all the time in designed landscapes. We plant the same thing because it's really beautiful. And it's often, cheaper and easier as well. And one last example from my colleague Mark Cadot in Toronto that maybe is relative to the kind of work you're doing is that they're finding that biodiversity, plant biodiversity, can promote reclamation as well. So they did a project in a former mine site in China, and they planted plots of anywhere from 1 to 16 plant species, and they looked at whether these mixtures, performed better. And they found that they did. The ways that these plants kind of fed back with the soil processes, the biophysical ecology at the heart of this, showed them that when you had a higher plant diversity, you had enhanced reclamation of these sites. So you had more biomass, you had less toxic foliage, you had better soil properties. And so it's not just that biodiversity can help us kind of maintain functions and benefits of our spaces, it can help us get them back too. And so I'll end here basically with, there was a little bit of a meandering train of thought, I think, but the core idea is that I think ecological thinking, understanding the functions of the species that we're planting, understanding these biophysical properties in collaboration with other disciplines can play a really important role in reimagining what our future landscapes could look like. Um, but I think these decisions, and hopefully we'll hear more of this in some of our other panels, they really need to be driven by the values and perspectives of local stakeholders and rights holders within these systems. And so I, as an ecologist, can, do a study and tell you, if you plant this, here's the outcome you'll get. Or if you focus on these species, here's the outcome you'll get. But that doesn't tell me what we should do. And what we should do is going to be based in, what do we value? What are we trying to restore in this space? And who gets to make those decisions? And I will
Are you done? Oh,
stop there.
great.
Yes, so an abrupt end because I'm running out of my time. But that's
No,
what I have
that's
for you, and I'm very
amazing.
open to discussion.
Well, we have a very long, these research students are really long. So as much time as you'll give us, we'll take pretty much. Thank you for that really brilliant and I think great opening discussion about kind of how to even think systemically and even about the language and ideas about what it means to reclaim, measure. I'm sure afterwards people will be asking you many, many questions about measurement and metrics. That's been a big topic in the previous courses where we have been talking to people in forestry in Northern Quebec. So Alessandra, should we go to the next? Do we want to do all the talks?
No, that was my question. If we start to have question now, or we save it for the final debate? We have a lot of questions, but my first one, are you collaborating with landscape architects or architects? I was extremely curious.
I'm trying to, a little bit. And so I've been trying to start collaborating more with architects and designers on some of this work, because I think
But
it's
here
really, so I collaborate. She's not a landscape architect, but Carmela Cucuzella Concordia, who is an architect and designer, we work together. I have also been working with an NGO, Nouveaux Voisins, who have some horticultural, designers, and they do, they're not landscape architect researchers, but do landscape architecture in practice. And so I've been trying to extend more of my work. I would be very happy to talk more about those kinds of collaborations.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
because
here is the proposition.
I think they're.
You should come to our final review of the studio. It's a very, Orit didn't like it. It's very painful, final reviews of architectural studios. It takes hours and hours, but it can be an interesting exercise for you.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting. And I think that's one of the big challenges, is that there is not a lot of kind of crosstalk between these disciplines, especially in training. I work as an urban ecologist. I don't have any training in planning. I don't have training in architecture. I don't have, landscape design training. And many of the architects and designers don't necessarily have a lot of ecological training. So I think there is a lot we could learn from each other that we haven't. And I think there's a certain amount of kind of naivety that comes with each field, where I'll say, like, well, we have to do this, and someone will say, well, we can't do that. Like, there's a good reason we don't do it that way. And so, from both sides. So I think it is really important to
but there is something to say about this in general. I mean, architects and landscape architects now, but it's been for decades now, they consider themselves more like orchestra directors, because we have to collaborate with different disciplines and different specialists. The last 2 days, I was like on a colloquium on Zoom in Italy, that was taking place in Italy, and it was about Haeckel and Humboldt and the relevance of Haeckel and Humboldt and their way of measuring things and depicting nature. And as you know, Haeckel was the one that introduced the notion of ecology, the word ecology, and in dialogue with contemporary designer of landscape. So it was quite interesting exercise, but we can come back to that.
Yeah, I think more of
that what is the relation between, what designers do and how they should collaborate with scientists. Anyway.
Absolutely. And I think there is still a lot of work that we need to do even as ecologists about understanding some of these relationships. I mean, I think ecology for such a long time was practiced in much more, I guess, kind of natural, I don't love the word natural, but natural kind of settings. And it's only, relatively recently that we've had a lot more work in, urban settings and really thinking about, you know, horticultural species and residential areas and gardens as ecological systems. And so there's still a lot more we can learn about how we can manage and design these systems from an ecological perspective, for sure.
So maybe, does anyone have like an immediate question? Because then I thought there's actually a nice conversation I think that could emerge between the different works, especially because there's a lot of different views on nature, but also on thinking about measurement and toxicity and different stuff. So I don't know. Does anyone? So maybe I was thinking, Michelle, would you mind? I think we'll go. Oh, turn to you.
Great. I'm happy to go. I'm just going to put on my timer to make sure I don't go over, because once I start talking,
we're not. You can talk. Like I said, actually,
on.
this is like a 5. How long is this thing? And you have time, so please take.
Okay. So, hi everybody. It's lovely to be here. I'm really curious to hear, actually, from everyone on this Zoom grid about their thinking about engaging this gold mine, and how it might resonate with work we're doing in our lab. So you can call me Murphy. I appreciate Orit's lovely introduction. Orit and I have known each other for many years, and I'm also learned so much from her. And the only thing I would add is that, like Jordan, I'm Métis, and I'm Métis from Winnipeg. So I run this lab called the Environmental Data Justice Lab, and it's in something called the Technoscience Research Unit. And it's an Indigenous-led, Indigenous majority lab that works on the question of visualizing colonial violence. And, I'm a science and technology studies person, so I kind of bring a lot of like the tech science thinking, data thinking, and then have to work with other people who bring in design and aesthetic things. And you'll probably notice that from my presentation that the aesthetic dimension of making slides is never my strong point. So here you can see some of our lab members, and you can see me, and on my left is Vanessa Gray. Vanessa Gray is co-lead on our project, and she's a community environmental justice researcher and land protector, Anishinaabe from Amjanong First Nation. So our lab has actually both community researchers and academic researchers, and our lab in general tends to gather BIPOC, Two-Spirit queer researchers as the majority of our members. And there's about 20 people overall, but these are some of the core people in this work. Then you see Daden Said, who comes out of Black data justice movements, and is diasporic from Somali, and so comes with their own set of thinkings about the relationship between colonialism and data and design. Next to them is Kristen Boss, who's also Métis from Treaty 6, and does Indigenous feminist work about relationships between body sovereignty and land sovereignty. And then next to her is Rina Shadan, who is from Malaysia, but had previously worked at Bhopal at the aftermath of the Bhopal disaster, which is like kind of one of the most famous and biggest industrial disasters that killed thousands of people and have in the 1980s, and then has a kind of ongoing legacy. And she comes out doing that kind of work to work with us in our lab. So we're really lucky to have such amazing people. And the work we do is very much influenced by this field that has, emerged maybe in the last 10 years. So only kind of during the scope of my career. like maybe halfway through, there's something called Indigenous STS became a thing in the world, and these are some of the kind of key authors who work in this field. And Indigenous science and technology studies tends to be working against the general flow of how university research operates, which likes to study Indigenous people, as opposed to have like Indigenous people or Indigenous values or Indigenous practices and relations, than being studying science and what science and technology, or we might call settler science, is up to. So that's kind of the direction of the work. And here's some more of the folks I think really influenced me. There's like actually a handful of Métis scholars who do this kind of work. And so I give a shout out to them especially. And so often when we're doing this work, like I live in Toronto, I'm on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. The work I do is on the territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, which is Ojibwe territory. It's not mine at all. And so like many of you, in thinking about this mine, one of the questions is like, how do we do good work on the territory of a different people? So that's something that I think all those people think about. So our lab is a kind of weird lab. We kind of operate according to different values than an ordinary lab. You know, we start with our goal is to make good relations. So there's a lot of different parts of that. Understand that most people in the lab are not from the territory that we're working on. We understand ourselves to not be studying Indigenous people, but to be Indigenous people and others working together to study settler colonial science. And sometimes we're complexly positioned in relationship to settler colonial science. You know, we work in the university, which is already a colonial operation. We have a land acknowledgement because these universities have colonial legacies. So part of what we're caught up in those things. And so we have to figure out how to call these relations and kins into responsibility, even as we try to do something else. And I don't know about Concordia, or U of M, but I'm assuming that the problem of white supremacy in the university is an ongoing dilemma. And that's something we, try not to shy away from. And then, we're nerds and tech people. And so we're really working with and against science and technoscience. We're not at all against data, measurement, science, but we're interested in how to have good relations and to bring other values to it. So often working in contradiction and in incommensurabilities, and trying to work to make the kind of practices we want to see in the world. And then in general, we have a kind of futurism approach. And this relates to reclamation. We're interested in how to build better worlds, both inside of our lab, but also like in the work we're doing, the land-based work we're doing. So core to our work is this understanding that violence on the land is violence on our bodies, so that we can't separate the effects of things like colonialism on land from the effects on our bodies, that our bodies are manifestations of land and in responsibility to land. So it's interesting to listen to Carly talking about the relationship between people and like ecologies. And then, and so here thinking sounds related to that, but like thinking about our bodies, like people, as manifestations of land and with responsibility to. And that also our bodies, our beings, including our non-human kin, is shaped by that land. And that land might be full of cities and pipelines and mines. And so this is also part, it's not just like we're full of waters and soils, but we're full of all these complicated relations. And so the question is like, then what is our like set of responsibilities if we think this way? And then I think like Carly's work, our work really starts with highly disrupted land. And particularly our work is about Chemical Valley, which I'll talk a little bit, Ontario's Chemical Valley, which I'll talk more about. But, we work on landscape or lands that are highly, highly disrupted by both capitalism and colonialism, and probably like this area of this mine. And one of the things about the temptation of reclamation, and I think this connects with what Carly was saying, is that, how do we understand what we value when a land is highly disrupted? Do we only love it after it's been reclaimed? Or what's our kind of affective and our relations of responsibility and care, and I will even say love, to spaces that, haven't been reclaimed, that are going to be, like if a mine doesn't go away, that are going to be in a state of relation to ongoing violence. So, how do we think about that, is one of our kind of core questions. So the project really looks at Ontario's Chemical Valley. This is where 40% of Canada's petrochemicals are refined. It's about 3 hours away from Toronto, along the St. Clair River, which goes between Lake Erie and Lake Huron on the north down to Lake Erie on the south. The east side is Ontario, Southern state of Canada. On the west side is the United States and Michigan. And it's the site of some of the world's most long-standing relations to fossil fuel capitalism. So it's the site of the world's first commercial oil field, and the Imperial Oil Refinery, which you see here, which is, we believe, the world's most long-standing refinery. There's another one in Pennsylvania that blew up last summer, and that was kind of competing for our oldest refinery, which goes back to the 1870s. And now Imperial Oil gets this wonderful title, and it's one of some 57 different facilities in this area. And the pollution in Chemical Valley is pretty bad. So Canada only has about 14 operating refineries, and the United States has something like 127. And the 14 refineries up in Canada do as much pollution of key pollutants like benzene, like sulfur dioxide, as the 127, which is kind of amazing. A refinery in Canada can have 50 to 60 times the amount of pollution of these key, really harmful pollutants. And I say this to you just to give you a sense of like how poorly regulated pollution is over here in Canada. It's quite abysmal. So this is the Imperial Oil Refinery, some imaging taken of it in 2017. So when we began our project, right after this happened. This is a flare. This is caught by on a cell phone. There are leaks, spills, flares, accidents in Chemical Valley pretty well every day, but at least every other day. But often they're very hard to document. This one is like, when you're able to catch the police beating someone up with your cell phone. Like this one was big, and you could just take a picture. People could just pull out their phone and document it very easily without any special equipment. So this is the flare. This is the press release that Imperial Oil, or the release, the informational release that they said about this. This was a grass fire. There were no emissions detected, and there are no injuries. So if you look at this, this is like crazy talk. This is pure lying and dissimulation. And this is kind of the informational regime that we deal with in Chemical Valley. Actually, this is a lot of words for an event. Usually now we get about one sentence, and it will say something like, unit was disrupted. Or hydrocarbons were emitted. Now there's like hundreds of kinds of hydrocarbons. So the information is super, super poor, and there's very little monitoring, physical monitoring. So in here you can get a sense of like, you get like a kind of tweet size explanation of what happens. And you can see how regular, these are just the other events that happened right around this time. They happen, almost every other day or every 3 days. And these are just the ones they comment on. So there's plenty that they don't comment on. So this is kind of what we're dealing with. Now, Vanessa, who I introduced you to, did a legal challenge about this flare, trying to get information through the Ontario government, did a court case with Eco-Justice, but then we had a change in provincial government. Looked like maybe some charges were going to be laid, but when we had the change in provincial government, it went away. So it's very hard even just to get any data, any physical measures, any inspection at all, even for such a large event. So what do you do? This is Chemical Valley. You can see the river. You can see it where Aamjiwnaang First Nation is, the territory of Aamjiwnaang First Nation. You can see it's surrounded by so many facilities. And then this is an image produced by a community member, David Plain, about showing Aamjiwnaang's territory. So it's kind of disconcerting because you think the blue might be water, but the white is water and the blue is land. And you can see that Aamjiwnaang's traditional territory is on both sides of the river. It's really huge. It goes all the way down, like on the south end of this river is Detroit. So this is like the beginning of oil fields down to Detroit automobiles. This is like fossil fuel capitalism. It's like basically invented over here. And this is this particular Three Fires Confederacy, Anishinaabe, Aamjiwnaang territory. Now that there's 3 different reserves and Aamjiwnaang is one of them. So you get a sense of like what it was like back in the day. The oil field started in the 1850s. When the oil field began, of course, it wasn't monitored at all. And I don't know the aging of this gold mine, but you know, environmental regulation is a recent thing, right? It maybe is invented in the 70s here in Canada, in the 60s, in the 80s. And before that, it's just like total free for all. So when we're working, there's, you know, 100 years before the state gets involved of free for all pollution. And, you know, commentators would regularly discuss that more oil would be spilled on the ground and into the water than would be collected in barrels, which is kind of amazing to think about. This is what Imperial Oil Refinery looked like in 1897. We began to see some of what it looks like a modern refinery, began to see its processing. This is just to give you a sense of how important Chemical Valley is. It's on the $10 bill, or what used to be on the $10 bill. It's a place that the Canadian government is very invested into. It supported the building out of what we could call the plastics and polymer industry and chemical industry. That's kind of, so you get the refining of the oil, then you have all the things you make out of oil, and that's what's built all around it. And you know, during the war, this kind of building out of this infrastructure was very much supported by the Canadians. Was a national project, and so Chemical Valley is like, it's on coins, it's on money. It's really part of the Canadian state, and its kind of understanding of itself as an industrial state. But you know, when we go into the archives, we also, you know, understand that each of these refineries and facilities is on Indigenous territory, and you can trace, and of course, Aamjiwnaang has done detailed work on this, the land theft, the process by which both the state, the Indian agents, particular facilities acquired land, often illegally, in order to make Chemical Valley. And so there's a whole history of using data, of mapping, of surveying, things that we still do today, often in the name of like reclamation or even reconciliation, but are entangled in a deeper history of these practices, of these kind of practices being weaponized, really, to make possible this kind of environmental violence and colonial violence. And you know, when we look at the history of Chemical Valley, we have that flair, but we can find, like in the newspaper or in the archives, like all sorts of different explosions, big accidents, and so on. And you know, Aamjiwnaang is known for, amongst many things, obviously the people at Aamjiwnaang have been doing land protection for some 150 years. So as long as there's been a Canada, as long as there's been a petrochemical complex. But they also are known for having documented the fact that there's a a sex ratio imbalance in Amjadong, where there's twice as many babies identified as boys as there are babies identified as girls at birth. And this is the only known community like that that isn't associated with like a big accident. But when you look at the history, there's just like a whole bunch of big accidents, actually. So in thinking about this work, we collaborated with Max Liboron and others to think about how is pollution a form of colonialism? You know, we've learned that residential schools are a form of colonialism, but how can we also understand that Canada's like long history of extraction, starting with the Hudson's Bay Company, starting with forestry, going into mining, going into oil, and its pollution that has really affected Indigenous people and the land, and our land-body relations is also a deadly form of colonialism. And we understand that the Canadian state, despite, you know, like having regulations and so on, we really see it as a permission to pollute state. So those laws, environmental laws, the monitoring, doesn't stop the environmental violence in Chemical Valley. Rather, it is more like we see it as it says, okay, well, here's the rule. You can pollute up to this amount. You know, that's okay. And so it is really, we see it as a permission to pollute system. So part of the history behind this is, you know, the idea of terra nullius, which grounds colonialism. And that's the idea like no one is here, right? When you're doing this kind of polluting, there's not already some kind of presence on the land. And we really want to always remember that any land here in Canada is actually Indigenous land. So wherever this, you know, gold mine is, it's on Indigenous land. There's already laws, governance, jurisdiction at work. And so what does it mean to kind of always remember that when you're doing this work? If the Canadian state's broken, if the Canadian state is not interested in the question of land protection, there's already other laws that are here that are very invested in the question of protecting the land. So we think about this kind of practice of erasing environmental violence as a kind of gaslighting, and a kind of, a theater of responsibility. And it is connected to racism. It is connected to the idea of racial gaslighting, or the way that you know, there's a predilection to pretend like racism isn't in operation or violence isn't in operation, and the kind of manipulation of data to allow that as a kind of argument. So in working with and against this kind of data and these kinds of technical practices, we understand ourselves to, on the one hand, wanting to refuse these bad practices, these kinds of violent practices, to name them, to say no to them. And at the same time, to not like give up on technology and data, and to figure out how can we put new kinds of like invention into the way that we deal with land protection. So in our lab, we try to unthink or rethink chemical pollution kind of with and against settler colonial data about chemical violence. So we try to name that gaslighting rather than, you know, argue with it. We're kind of like, no, that's just gaslighting. And what we're going to use this data is to like show that's gaslighting. We're going to use this data to show a permission to pollute system, not to try to argue whether or not pollution is happening, because we know it's happening. Secondly, we try to say no to damage-based research. So we do not want to do research or get involved in research or support research that's about showing the damage to Indigenous community that this pollution is doing. You know, of course, community does its own work on health and what's happening. But, you know, people can offer up the evidence of their bodies over and over, and ultimately the state doesn't really care. And so we want to do desire-based research. And this is drawing on the work of Eve Tuck. Like, what kind of future, a better future, what kind of less harmful future can we build? And then the other part is like, the data on pollution tends to look at chemicals one by one. They treat them as individual molecules, as like just like the little objects you can maybe measure with it. You need an instrument to measure. And we want to refuse this idea that this pollution isn't completely obvious. We don't want to say it's just like a small molecule that needs a special thing to measure. It's actually gigantic. The whole community can sense it constantly. It actually is not so fancy to like understand. It's big, it's there, it's huge, and it's actually interconnected with all sorts of things we can describe. So thinking about habit 2, damage-based research, we want to say no. We want to suspend research that's about kind of describing damage. We want to, it relates to the idea of ethnographic refusal. We want to say no to the study of Indigenous people. And we want to kind of really be mindful about any kind of extractive tendency in our research, because in the university, like, we're often invited to extract from the world, right? And for our own careers, our own designs, our own pleasures. And we're kind of consciously always looking for ways to say no to any extractive modality. So what we want to do is we want to confront this gaslighting data, name it as such. We want to refuse damage-based research. We want to connect then the pollution that we know is there to its extensive and infrastructural relations. And we want to design for community desires and support the already existing Indigenous sovereignty. So if we think chemical violence is not small, we can look back at this image from Aaron Consmo that I kind of had at the beginning and think about, when we breathe in pollution, when there's pollution in the land around this mine, it's not just a chemical. It's not just the presence of a toxin, it's the presence of a system. It's the presence of infrastructures and social structures like pipelines, like financing models, and so on. And so how do we kind of begin to connect these dots? So we think about violence from refineries as violence on our bodies. We look at who owns these refineries. So the Imperial Oils actually was bought up in the late 19th century by Standard Oil, who it was then the world's biggest oil company. Standard Oil becomes ExxonMobil, which is one of the world's biggest oil companies. So that's who actually owns Imperial Oil. It's a big multinational next to the other refineries there, like Shell, Suncor. These are really big global companies. They're not just facilities in a place. And I'm sure that's true with Atibi as well. And the gold mine, it's connected to a larger infrastructure. There's also the pipelines that facilitate this whole process of Chemical Valley. They meet in Sarnia, they meet here, they reach up to the Bakken Shield, they reach up to the tar sands. There's the big shipping in the Great Lakes. This is a big, big structure. So we kind of look at these kinds of things thinking this is a continental actual infrastructure that meets and is intensified in Chemical Valley. It's on Anishinaabe jurisdiction, but it's part of a big system that we need to build solidarity around. And things like pipelines, railroads, shipping channels, those kind of infrastructures actually help us reach across communities or across mines, we might say, or across refineries. And build solidarity across a system that's actually quite big and not just local. And then, we do all this kind of forensic work, like who owns Imperial Oil, who owns ExxonMobil, what's the kind of the history of it. A lot of it is owned by venture capital. Most of Imperial Oil is owned by hedge funds and so on. And most of ExxonMobil is actually owned by hedge funds and big investment funds. And so it is ultimately these facilities don't even have like company owners. They're owned by financial capital. So what does it mean to like draw those infrastructures, not just up to the pipelines and stuff, but thinking about their financing? What keeps these violent things going? So downtown is like one of the world's hotspot. Downtown Toronto is one of the world's hotspots for mining companies and headquarters. The Toronto Stock Exchange is one of the most important places for the exchange of extraction-related commodities. TD Bank has a really important history of this. And so this is also kind of part of our thinking about when we work on Chemical Valley. And so things like divestment as a practice really matter to the work we're doing. What does it mean to go to kind of work across spaces and figure out how to address these infrastructures that are actually creating the local pollution and call them into a jurisdictional responsibility, which is on Anishinaabe land? So we can think finance capital is also violence on our bodies, is also violence on the land. It can get quite abstract. So all of this is part of a way of thinking about environmental data justice, the way surveillance, the way the state monitors and doesn't monitor things, right? The way that there's always a distribution of not enough data and too much data, too much surveillance and not enough surveillance, that works along particular lines of inequity. That there's often a criminalization of land defenders and indigenous people try to speak out against this kind of surveillance, as well as to speak in favor of land protection. So that's part of what's going on too. So then just let me turn to like the question of data futures and how we might build data futures then trying to address pollution and ongoing colonial environmental violence. So I don't know if people have heard of indigenous data sovereignty, but this is a set of principles. It's a kind of transnational movement that indigenous people on their territory should have possession, control, be able to guide and collect data. And so right now, indigenous communities are largely in a relationship of data dependency to the settler state. So the question is how to get closer and closer to this kind of like data sovereignty and have data work for indigenous community. Thinking about that on our territory, we're really guided by things like the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant about like how to be in good relation together. If we look at this, this is a kind of another way of thinking about data and data practices. It's a mnemonic. It's using quahog shells. I'm hoping people know about wampum belts. No. Okay, so this is like when we think about treaties, like when you're on your phone and you get like a terms and service thing, you click I agree. Like this kind of like that's like what treaties were like. Like, they were like, sign this thing that no one's going to be able to like manifest. And sometimes people would even be like, their signatures would be put on blank papers and they'd write it after. And that's what happened in Toronto. And so that's like what we think about treaties. It's like it's like a piece of paper. It's a contract, you sign, you're done. Well, there's a whole other technology of treaty making here on the Great Lakes that's all has to be ongoing. It's relationship building. So that's manifested in this kind of wampum belt. It's made out of quahog shells. So there's like always a binary, white and purple. And to make the treaty, you had to like make this image. You had to talk about it and discuss like what it's going to represent. It takes like maybe many, many months to make a big wampum belt. The way the leather is open at the end means this treaty has to go on like forward in time, and you have to keep taking care of this belt. You have to keep returning to the conversations and figuring out what it means. It has to have an ongoing relation. You have to have tremendous amounts of socializing and coming together, feasting, talking as you make it, as you discuss it, as you come into the agreement. You have to return to that over and over. So what happens if we like did our data collection like that? What happens if we did our reclamation like that? It's a really different way. And this is like a piece of art that where some folks put it up in downtown Toronto, and it says in Anishinaabemowin, like if you start someplace, start here. Right? So it's thinking like, what does it mean to go back to Indigenous jurisdiction, to be guided by maybe its practices for figuring out how we should deal with pollution, how we can take care of lands. So even in the city, even in a disruptive place like Chemical Valley. And how might we do these data differently? Here we look at the work of like Jennifer Wegamawan's. We look at Karen Recollet's work on like making digital future bundles together. What does it mean to think about like when we do this stuff, it's not just like fix something that's broken, but we're doing desire-based work, trying to like work for the future and offer things up for the future that might even be like future generations, because like we're not going to undo mining like tomorrow, and we're not going to take apart fossil fuel capitalism tomorrow, but we're like making these future bundles for each other to kind of keep doing this work. And so there's a kind of desire-based futurism in it that's speculative as well. So our lab, I know I'm taking up a lot of time, I'm gonna wrap up. Our lab made this app called the Pollution Reporter app. We made it with Amjinong First Nation. It's still being made. It's now just on version 2, and we're working with the environmental committee at Amjinong to develop version 3. And it really does two things. It tries to collect polluters to pollutants to health, guided by indigenous values, to provide a different kind of set of informational practices for community members to then bring into their practices of activating indigenous jurisdiction to say, polluters, you are polluting too much. And then we also has a reporting function so that community members, instead of relying on industry to report spills and say something, they can generate their own reports. So we're trying to build up an indigenous notification system inside of Anjanong. So you can get a little bit of a sense of what it looks like aesthetically. It's really important to us that it's not alarming, that it's beautiful, that it manifests the land, that it's for the community members, that it's accessible in its language. So we do a lot of work of translating peer-reviewed technical literatures into accessible language. So you can like start with a polluter, you can get to then all its, we use so there's something called the National Pollution Release Inventory, and I'm sure the mine has one too. And so every facility has to report if it does emissions every year of some 300 different chemicals. Most of their reporting is going to be based on estimates and not on any physical measure, so the data lacks a kind of integrity, but it's one of the rare sources of data that we have in Canada where a company will admit to polluting. And so it's really useful for that reason. So we use that admission to connect each company to their polluting practices. We then connect that to health research, and people can like search about all sorts of things like headache or something like that, like, you know, as opposed to just like cancer, because often the government only wants to like look at things when there's like a really clear diagnosis as opposed to like a felt symptom. And then we also have this kind of polluting, so this reporting function that we have. And so we're trying to also like manifest, I think here's another thing, aesthetically, like the interconnection of all these things, of the data, of the polluter, of the pollution, of the health effects, of the land, and so on, a different way of manifesting data. So then my kind of invitation to you is like in this project, like what kind of information bundles are you making maybe in your design, or what kind of future bundles? Like what information, what kind of design do communities need to help endure and heal, right? And what kind of design practices and what kind of responsibilities we need to bring into our design and data practices when there's an ongoing emergency of colonialism, right? That maybe, you know, I don't know exactly the status of this one, but like these things, they don't just end. So when it's ongoing, what kind of ongoing responsibilities, how do we need to think about time and future that this way? And ultimately, and maybe this resonates with what Carly was saying, like, this is a harm reduction project. Like it's a project of trying to reduce harm and build capacity for better futures, as opposed to a romantic project that just thinks we can fix the land. And so what does it mean to then just like be really open about that and you know, love, be in a relationship of responsibility and love to like disrupted spaces that aren't going to be fixed. So this is a little bit of art from Dylan Miner, who's on the other side of the river. Even from toxic spaces, we will grow strong and beautiful. So thank you. Here's my funders.
Thank you. There is so much I actually want to ask you about. But first, is there any like immediate questions that people might have about Michelle's presentation, or we'll wait for the longer discussion? One thing that immediately for me, I was kind of just curious, maybe collaborate right now a little bit about, you use this term future bundles, but I was kind of wondering what's in the bundle that you're making. Is it this data report and app, or is it does it comprise other things?
Well, there's lots of ways of thinking about future bundles. So bundles are like, you know, I don't know if you'll hear of like birch bark bundles. Like, so people would have like bundles that you might even have personally, or bundles that are like for your community that might contain like medicines, might contain like mnemonics, right? That then are important for like remembering histories and and stories. And these are bundles that you might carry with you, but you might also like put in the ground along, you know, and put in different places, both for maybe when you return to a particular land or on a particular route of like itinerary, let's say with the season, or, you know, on the, you know, Anishinaabe people, while they have been on this territory for thousands of years, they're also people who migrated. And so like putting it on the migratory routes as a kind of thing of return for future generations. Like petroglyphs can be understood as a kind of future bundle, right? They might last for thousands of years, and then you, or hundreds of years, and they're like messages from the past for the future. And it can be plants, so the ways that like the trees and particular forests were kind of cared for that can only exist if people take care of them in certain ways, like black oak savannas. And that these are like future bundles, and the kind of branches would be like bent in a particular way to like even point to things like in directions. But then we can now in like the contemporary, we think, well, what's a future bundle? Like a future bundle can like contain like art, it can contain like music, it can contain like a digital recording, it can contain it can be in the form of a website instead of a petroglyph, though we know those have problems of obsolescence, right? And so when we think about like future bundles, it's both for ourselves maybe, but more importantly, it's like thinking intergenerationally and community wise, right? About the work we do is ultimately, you know, for this bigger, in this bigger trajectory. And we do it to leave behind like the help that maybe we needed, or maybe that we've had. And so it's thinking that way about building technologies. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. This was so rich, and I really looking forward to the discussion. But before Jordan speaks, actually he left for a moment, but never mind. I wanted to clarify a little bit, because you kept saying that we are working on one gold mine, but actually yes, with Orit, we have this particular project on mining reclamation in this region of Quebec, of the province of Quebec, that is called Abitibi-Témiscamingue. And there is this big open pit gold mine that has been there. I mean, the areas, they started to exploit this region in 1915, 1920. So it's 1 century. It's been there and it's still active. Okay, but this is one thing. What we are doing in this studio, and it's a research studio, we do research by design. It's technical terms for architectural practice way of doing research. What I propose to the students, it's a bit complex, and this is also for Carly, but she was talking about urban. I think Orit sent you the proposal for the studio, but maybe you didn't have time to take a look, but it's more complex. It's actually, it's called the Free Ecologies. So Carly, you may like it. So the idea is, and the idea is to work on this region that is called Abitibi-Témiscamingue. And that was one of what Quebec considers the northern frontiers. So the opening of the north to especially, which very interesting, you know, connotation, because the north was the promise to the Francophone Canadians. And so they started to colonize this region at the beginning of the last century. So it's the door to the north, and it's today is still it's called a resource region. And so the first wave of colonization was agriculture in an extreme condition. So, so agriculture and forestry that was necessary to sort of like for the settlers to survive. And then in the 1920s, in this region, they discovered this rich geological formation that is nickel, copper, and gold. and they started to create, so you have like a number of settlements that were more related to agriculture, other to hydro and forestry. That means also scierie. Sorry, I'm saying this in French, but pulp and paper industry, so more industrial settlements, and then mining towns. And this is going on. And the interesting thing on this region is that now they are promoting, Quebec government is promoting the passage to the industry 4.0 in mining and forestry, first of all, but also in agriculture. So this is why I call it the free ecologies, because this free form of exploitations are connected. They began with a very precise project of colonization, which is the colonization of the North for the French Canadians. So, and of course, they did encounter indigenous populations, so First Nations that were like established in the territory. So this is the process that is ongoing and is still there. So still this idea that Abitibi-Témiscamingue, it's a resource region. It's there to be exploited. But with the passage to these very advanced forms of technology, 4.0, in mining and mining, agriculture, and forestry. So this is the context that we have been discussing now since the beginning of January with the students, to give you a better idea of what the students have been reading and analyzing about. It's an extremely interesting context because actually all the problems that interest us today are there, also with this colonial attitude that is there from the beginning, and with this history of colonialism and post-colonialism, with First Nations presence and active in the area, and with this massive thing of that is still a resource and a region where people are extracting from, that it's there for that. Okay, I wanted to clarify.
Yeah,
I think this is going to help the discussion.
yeah, I think there'll be a lot of interest in your work, and I do want to accentuate, there is this reclamation project that some of these students will be, but a lot of the studio is about doing the kind of mapping that perhaps your lab is also interested in, of actors, of players, but also we have a real question: how are the new digital technologies transforming the extraction industries, and to what end? And so really thinking about ethical modes of data visualization and data collection is a super concern for this class that we will definitely be asking you about afterwards. So thank you so much for that presentation, and for the studio in general, and for the kind of materials we produce out of it. So thank you, Michelle, and thanks, Alessandra. Competing energy imaginaries in the contemporary Canadian mediascape examines extractive and post-extractive energy and infrastructural imaginaries through a series of infrastructural case studies and the cultural narratives that inframe him. He is published very widely, and I want to say that he also is an inspiration to this because his work on reclamation and critical thinking about discourses of reclamation really hopefully will bring to light issues of the politics of kind of this sort of research studio and what we're trying to do. So welcome, Jordan.
Yeah, so today I'm sort of using this as an opportunity to revisit the piece that I wrote and shared on oil sands reclamation, which I wrote a few years ago. It took a while to publish, actually, so it was a nice opportunity to kind of revisit my thinking about reclamation in light of kind of the work of people like Caitlin Bennett and Arne Keeling, whose other article I assigned today. So what I've sort of put together today comes out of me thinking about that piece that I had written, and then also about this kind of newer work that's a more sort of critical look at reclamation and kind of expanding our understanding of what reclamation could be. So I have a few thoughts on that, and also I have a lot more sort of background about the oil sands in particular, and about the problem that they represent for reclamation. So that's kind of a point I wanted to make before starting, is my analysis in that article and what I'm going to sort of put forward today is grounded particularly in the oil sands themselves, not necessarily about reclamation in general. So each sort of mode of reclamation is dependent on the actual kind of site that's being reclaimed. And so I do kind of want to make sure that, you know, because I'm extremely critical, I guess, of the oil sands reclamation project in general, and I don't want that to necessarily translate as all existing reclamation is being critiqued under this lens. It's more just in this particular setting that I think can provide us some insight in thinking about how we imagine our relationship to energy and how we imagine our relationship to environment through the question of reclamation. So on that note too, I'm primarily trained in literary and cultural analysis, which kind of conditions the types of questions that I ask and how I go about it. So I did want to, you know, put some disciplinary cards on the table there, just at the get-go. And yes, the abandoned barley malting factory, that is my go-to background for my slides these days. I also live near it and have, you know, ran by it several times over the pandemic to the tune of probably a few hundred kilometers at this point. So I'll begin my talk with a historical fiction. In 1967, the first commercial oil sands surface mining and refining plant, which was grandiosely named the Great Canadian Oil Sands Plant, went online using Dr. Carl Clark's hot water method for separating bitumen from sands into a usable commodity. Scientists and engineers in charge of treating the tailings, the waste byproduct of extracting and processing bitumen using Clark's method, soon realized that the unique makeup of the Athabasca bitumen produced a unique tailings that were untreatable with current methods. These scientists and engineers sounded the alarm, and extraction was halted until an effective process was developed, swiftly avoiding this potential historical ecological catastrophe. Initially planned for release back into the Athabasca River after treatment, the unique material character of oil sands tailings evaded the current methods of treatment, which was modeled on copper tailings. As a result, the tailings were unable to be returned to the flows from which they were diverted. As Jody McNeil details in a 2017 report for the Pembina Institute, the solids in oil sands tailings will take centuries to settle to the bottom of the pond. And as a result, it is impossible to dewater the waste for timely reclamation without significant intervention. This plotline of disruption to the momentum of oil sands extractivism is, of course, a fiction for a reason. The government of Alberta did find, as early as 1973, that oil sands tailings were unique in their material makeup and ultimately unable to be treated to a degree where they could be returned to the flow of the Athabasca without serious ecological consequences. But a solution was not found in those early days when the Great Canadian Oil Sands Corporation plant went online. One hasn't been found yet, and extraction has continued while tailings ponds accumulated across the northern landscape over the past 60 years or so. And so this is a satellite image where you can see those tailings. Fast forward to the third decade of the 21st century, and we have evidence that now over 1.3 trillion liters of tailings ponds have broken containment measures and are leaking into groundwater. And it seems they have been leaking for a while. And so this sort of speaks, I guess, to the kinds of pollution gaslighting that was brought up earlier. On December 14th, 2020, a report from the Commission of Environmental Cooperation, or CEC, conceded that according to industry data, the tailings are leaking 4 billion liters each year, and that an independently studied report asserted that the oil sands process affected water is reaching into the Athabasca River system. The commission argued that the Government of Canada is failing to effectively enforce subsection 36.3 of the Canadian Fisheries Act with respect to the leaking of deleterious substances from oil sands tailings ponds into surface waters and the groundwaters of Northeast Alberta. The findings, as the temporality of my historical fiction suggests, were a long time coming. These tailings ponds have been a central contentious issue since the oil sands mega project gained steam in the 1960s. from the now mythical episode when in 2008, animal deterrent technologies, particularly propane cannons like the one pictured here that go off every 20 seconds in the oil sands landscape, failed on a Syncrude's tailings pond, and over 1,600 ducks died. And we can also think of Edward Bertinsky's oil series that features these tailings, described by visual culture scholar Jennifer Peoples as expressing a kind of toxic sublime. So the broader environmental imaginary of the oil sands is marked by these tailings ponds. And though the ponds were created as a temporary prospect until more effective treatment measures were developed, their scale of accumulation has resulted in a scenario where the tailings are themselves breaching containment, returning to the Athabasca River system in an event that fundamentally undermines the purpose of the ponds in the first place. So I want to begin here with a meditation on the inertia of extraction and its aftermaths, because the ever multiplying tailings ponds bring into relief some of the central questions of reclamation and limits and possibilities of post-extractive landscapes in Alberta's oil sands, as well as some questions about the temporalities of scientific knowledge production and the burdens of proof that favor the extractive apparatuses of oil sands production more than those communities and ecosystems who most acutely feel the costs of extraction. So today I'd like to use the compounding ecological catastrophe embodied in the tailings ponds as a point of departure to explore the conflict between temporalities of science and extractive capital that it represents, while linking this discussion to the problem of temporal and spatial scale under which reclamation operates in the shadow of what I've been calling Canada's extractive state apparatus. So my larger goal is to interrogate how this conflict is persistent, or to interrogate how this conflict links to persistent ecological violence that results from an unevenly distributed burden of proof put on the former while the latter chugs along, and to question how extractive temporalities are discursively mobilized to promote the oil sands mega project. Before zooming in more closely on actually existing oil sands reclamation and my own critical interventions, I'd like to briefly work through a constellation of keywords that have helped attune my critical senses to conceptual pressure points that inform potential practices for more equitable modes of reclamation. So these terms: organized abandonment, slow violence, unjust infrastructures, perpetual care, and case studies to kin studies. So a kind of narrative emerges here. I'll define each of these terms very briefly. So organized abandonment, and I'm thinking particularly of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's use, building off of David Harvey, who first described it as a central consequence of contemporary capitalism and neoliberal state reorganization. But Ruth Wilson Gilmore returns to the concept to address forgotten places and their relations that bear the brunt of systemic social and ecological violence, which she develops through an analysis of carceral landscapes, infrastructures, relations, and cultures in the United States. And I'm happy to share the readings after in PDF form or citations after the talk. So moving to slow violence, from Rob Nixon's Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, a very important book for post-colonial eco-criticism, but has sort of a life beyond literary humanities. So slow violence names durational, unspectacular forms of ecological violence that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable peoples and ecosystems while evading representation, which in turn limits potential for action towards reconciliation in these terms. Unjust infrastructures is a term that I use, but have sort of derived it in conversation with work by historian Christopher Jones, who's done an analysis of the unjust character of energy transmission infrastructures like canals for coal and pipelines for oil that unevenly distribute the costs and benefits of the fossil economy, a term that describes an economy of infinite growth made possible by the production and consumption of fossil fuels. So Jones, in his historical study based in the United States, primarily cites a disparity between urban centers enjoying the fruits of fossil fuels, while peripheral rural communities endure the consequences of extraction. In my own work, I directly name this concept of unjust infrastructures and draw out the terminology to reflect on the settler colonial inertia of fossil fuel infrastructure. So not just this disparity between urban and rural, but actually the kind of settler colonial momentum built in to fossil fuel energy infrastructure. Perpetual care. I think this is a really important concept to grapple with in thinking about reclamation, and one of the kind of most important contributions that the Beckett and Keeling piece makes, both of whom are critical geographers based out of Memorial University. And they propose perpetual care as a way of approaching reclamation that moves beyond the technological register to more expansive, justice-oriented decolonial process. And I think process is also an important word to emphasize here. And thinking about the kind of dimensions of a kin study, I'm going to conclude with a bit of an elaboration on that. But for now, I'm just sort of throwing this constellation of terminology out here to keep in mind as I sort of move forward. So kin, this is a direct quote from the piece by Todd and Kanjuser. It reads, kin study attends to the separations that case studies insert between place, thought, and relations. And so this separation is, I think, kind of one of the key dimensions to keep in mind. So I'll directly reference these terms, some of them, and some of them I won't, but I sort of want us to keep these in mind as I kind of zoom in more closely on the sort of historical and territorial setting of the oil sands. So until recently, the oil sands were commonly referred to as tar sands, and due to the scale and intensity required for extraction and refining, activist Zipporah Berman has argued that they represent the single largest and most destructive industrial project on Earth. As I mentioned earlier, the unique material properties of the bitumen contained in the oil sands are what demand this intensity. To turn the goopy tar-like substance into a usable commodity requires modes of technoscientific innovation that consume resource inputs such as water and liquefied natural gas in massive quantities. The politics of land are central to the political economies and political ecologies of the oil sands life cycle. Crown land, that is land owned by the state, is leased in parcels to companies with the clause that the land will eventually be reclaimed and returned to the province of Alberta in a state equivalent to its pre-extractive condition. But what constitutes equivalence remains murky, and as of 2021, only one mine project, as you know from reading my piece, has fully completed this cycle. These political economies and ecologies are particularly significant, given that as a nation, Canada is simultaneously the product of imperialism, and as landscape architect Pierre Bélanger reminds us in Extraction Empire, undermining the system, states, and scales of Canada's global resource empire, a participant in and sanctioner of imperialism, both at home and abroad. The introduction to a recent issue of the South Atlantic Quarterly, entitled Getting Back the Land, Anti-Colonial and Indigenous Strategies of Reclamation, and I'd like to emphasize the word reclamation in this subtitle, intervenes upon these questions surrounding extraction, the nation state, territoriality, and dispossession by exploring how Canada's dubious claims of jurisdiction undermine Indigenous sovereignty and obscure generative Indigenous economies outside and against settler colonial capitalism. So in this issue's introduction, the editors Sherry Pasternak and Dana Nadine Scott detail how, quote, Canada's claim to exclusive territorial authority across all the lands and waters is a failed project. So these persistent, contentious, and high stakes questions of jurisdiction and territory meet with the uniquely intensive life cycle of oil sands production in the arenas of political economy and ecology. Such a life cycle encapsulates processes that range from deploying new methods of extraction to building and operating transmission infrastructures such as pipelines, and as a final stage, implementing post-extractive reclamation techniques on affected landscapes that are ultimately returned to the state. At the stage of extraction and refinement, as I opened today with saying, the material properties of the bituminous sands notably resist refinement into a substance with the expansive use value we have come to expect from oil, and as a result have required significant technological innovation to make it viable in these terms. Sitting below the surface of the Athabasca oil sands, as we know them today, is an entanglement of technoscientific knowledges and extractive capitalist frontiers. So the Athabasca oil sands are a significant geological formation from a number of perspectives, long used by indigenous peoples in its raw form for purposes such as sealing leaks on canoes. The bitumen that bubbles across the shores of the Athabasca River was noticed by early colonizers as a potentially valuable material. In 1776, fur trader Peter Pond, the first European settler to enter the region, speculated on the value of bitumen in ways that anticipated the sand's political economic status today. However, it was not until the mid-20th century when Dr. Carl Clark, a chemist who made a name for himself by working for the Canadian Geologic Survey, and later as a professor at the University of Alberta, discovered an effective process to separate usable bitumen from the sands, that the viability of the economic exploitations of the sands became feasible. And that's sort of what I opened earlier with, was the paper in Nature from the 30s that detailed this process. So promotional lore like that on display at the Oil Sands Discovery Center in the municipal epicenter of the oil sands of Fort McMurray frames this techno-scientific pursuit as an entrepreneurial endeavor. Following this entrepreneurial momentum, a more efficient method was developed to access deposits that are unreachable through strip mining, called steam-assisted gravity drainage, pioneered in the 1970s by Dr. Roger M. Butler, who the Canadian Petroleum Hall of Fame describe as the father of steam-assisted gravity drainage. SAG-D, as it's called, offers access to bitumen deposits that lay deeper than strip mining can reach, ultimately increasing possibilities for production and exploration. Like hydrofracturing, or what's commonly called fracking, SAG-D disrupts geologic formations well below the surface, leaving above ground landscapes looking undisturbed. So due to surface aesthetics, SAG-D is commonly promoted as less ecologically impactful on surface ecosystems, though the degree to which it impacts those ecosystems is still unclear. In this way, SAG-D is both an environmental and cultural technology, as it plays a central role in oil and gas industry promotional materials, as it retains visible features of the affected landscapes that reflect dominant Western perceptions of natural value. The landscapes of SAG-D offer those undisrupted lines of sight that are inextricably bound to what cultural anthropologist Macarena Gomez-Barris has called the extractive view, the very view that renders ecosystems into spaces ripe for extraction in the first place. So this is all to say that innovation as such, an innovation whose genealogy is deeply tied to neoliberal and entrepreneurial subjectivities that underwrite contemporary extractive capitalism, is constitutively entangled with the oil sands imaginaries in ways that exceed the technical processes that these technologies perform. So the material economic circuit of oil sands production can be condensed in shorthand to something like this: extraction, separation, upgrading, and transmission, followed by treatment of waste or byproducts like those tailings ponds that I mentioned earlier, and eventually reclamation. In this circuit of production, the fossil economy relies on and impacts webs of relations that exist outside of and adjacent to capitalism, and serve as a recent episode in the longer history of the formal subsumption of nature. So producing a materially and economically viable commodity from the Athabasca oil sands and other oil sands deposits in that region rely on a set of coexisting favorable conditions, including conditions that are at once spatial jurisdictional and political economic, and these conditions persist in the afterlives of these extractive landscapes. The spatial jurisdictional and territorial dynamics of oil sands extraction have been a fundamental site of struggle in the pursuit of social and ecological justice by Indigenous nations and communities affected by this extraction. So before moving into reclamation more closely, I'd like to briefly discuss a campaign by the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, which is mobilizing the terms and conditions of Treaty 6 to charge the government of Canada with treaty violations due to the cumulative impacts of extractivism, a case that will be a precedent-setting one in shaping the contours of the jurisdictional pursuit of social and ecological justice, animated by a recognition of the impacts of slow violence. So I kind of wanted to flag this to the side here as we're kind of seeing the kind of concept of slow violence kind of being leveraged here in a particular way in the pursuit of social and ecological justice. So by mobilizing the terms and conditions of historical treaties in this way, it also opens up avenues for expanding what we mean by reclamation. And this is a point I'll return to in my conclusion, after zooming in on some of the dynamics of actually existing oil sands reclamation. So I'll see if this starts playing, and hopefully it's not too loud.
This is an active mining operation in the Canadian oil sands. It's not a very pretty sight when you open up the earth in order to extract the oil, but after this operation is finished, it will be reclaimed. All this land around us has been mined. Look at it now. You have this beauty returning to the landscape. Here I've got alder, spruce, aspen. Where there was once an oil sands mining operation, you now have a beautiful biodiverse landscape again, where you'd never know there'd been a mine there in the first place.
So just as a side point, I do mention a bit about the figure in this video, Patrick Moore, but I'll mention a bit more. I'm pretty sure that the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers tried to remove this video from the web after Patrick Moore was cited in, he kind of caused a news controversy. He was the person who said that drinking Roundup was safe. It happened in 2015, I think, and caused quite a media event to the point where they tried to kind of erase this video off of YouTube and other places on the internet. But I had it archived, so. So as I detailed in the chapter that I assigned for reading, all land rented by oil companies in Alberta must, by contract, be reclaimed at some endpoint. And that reclamation clause specifies that the land is to be returned to an equivalent land capability. And to determine this capability, I argue in the piece that I assigned that oil sands reclamation employs 1, a productivist epistemology of utility, 2, Western aesthetics of nature and landscape, which is why Moore relies very heavily on visual vocabularies when describing the reclamation landscape that he's walking through, and also in a kind of scientific knowledge production that carries on extractive relations after extraction. So these are kind of the 3 pillars of my argument in that piece. But today I think I'd like to talk a bit about how the legal clause of reclamation is often promotionally leveraged as evidence that the vast ecological impacts of oil sands production, which include the processes of strip mining or steam-assisted gravity drainage, to those 1.3 trillion liters of tailings ponds. The assertion that this can and will be undone. So my work on reclamation has come out of an investigation into the pro-oil movement in Canada. This is an important point to make, I think, which is a loose coalition of largely social media-based groups and organizations that claim grassroots status and support in order to frame Canadian oil as a socially, economically, and ecologically positive force. And so I've put some memes from one of these groups up on the screen here, from Oil Sands Strong, and also a screenshot from the Government of Canada's website on reclamation to just kind of show how reclamation as an existing technology is really being put forward as a kind of solution to the problems that the ecological consequences of extraction, with a very strong emphasis on that this can and will be sort of reconciled, mainly due to the fact that there's a contract that binds them to these terms and conditions, but only a very small percentage has ever actually gone through this process, and it's still sort of out to speculation as to the effectiveness of existing techniques for actually dealing with things like the tailings ponds. Okay. So something I don't talk about in the article that I assigned, but also is worth sort of visualizing, is this impact, or is that the scale of what's been reclaimed and what's sort of in other separate sort of processes of reclamation. I think this visualization, which is taken from the Government of Alberta website several years ago, which is constantly updating and changing, but this I saved does a good job of really sort of providing the data of how little is even in the process of being reclaimed, let alone has actually been certified reclaimed. So you can see at the top, the sliver is the certified reclaimed. And that's our Gateway Hill, which is the one I mentioned in the article. Okay. I have a couple text-heavy slides, but I'll read the key sort of points from them. So the only certified reclaim project that exists, Gateway Hill, began reclamation in 1983, and its certification was received in 2008. And so this temporal scale is often gestured to as a means to deflect criticism of the inadequacy of the pace, scale of reclamation efforts. So you can see that happening here. Another one of these groups that I've studied is really leaning on this process. It takes so long, and so we're never going to really see the fruits of reclamation until maybe 50 years from now, is the speculation here. And so the uncertainty surrounding a contractually obligated process, one that must happen at some point in the future, sits in stark contrast to the demands for certainty, for evidence that the tailings ponds have been breached by containment methods. So I think these kind of two scenarios put some interesting kind of questions on the table about who gets to benefit from certainty and uncertainty in these settings. So this doesn't happen overnight, which is probably the most important phrasing here, emerges as a refrain for the fossil economy that deepens a deadlock or impasse that reproduces the relations of extractive capital and pushes those relations further into the future. So this kind of constant process of deferral is something that I look at in my work, of deferring a future of, energy transition, of a just energy future. These sorts of relations are constantly deferred in this kind of vocabulary. So returning to the question of leaking tailings and the accusations that the Canadian government failed to enforce its Fisheries Act, I think brings into relief who gets to reap the benefits of certainty and uncertainty. So this is really long, but I'll read a little bit of it. This is the response to the claim that the Fisheries Act was violated. The response by the Canadian government was that they did not have reasonable grounds to believe that there were violations of the pollution prevention provisions of the Act for any of the inspections conducted. The main reason for this was that when deleterious substances were found in groundwater samples, enforcement officers could not determine if they came from natural or anthropogenic sources. So officers were not able to establish that a person deposited or permitted the deposit of a deleterious substance. So to me, there's some interesting kind of dynamics happening here that are kind of like a micro scale of sort of broader kind of issues surrounding, ecological catastrophes like climate change at a planetary scale, where this kind of question of whether it came from natural or anthropogenic sources is this kind of mode of uncertainty that gets exploited by extractive capitalism to continue extractive processes. Okay. So my sort of takeaway here is that reclamation projects like Gateway Hill are a kind of proof of concept, an extractive capitalist science fiction that's used as a promotional tool to justify further extraction. And so I'd like to conclude by turning to the lexicon for reclamation that I offered earlier: organized abandonment, slow violence, unjust infrastructure, perpetual care, and the question of kin study. So like tailings ponds, another multiplying, intensifying, or percolating ecological catastrophe looms over Alberta, abandoned, orphaned wells, whose future reclamation likely depends on the use of public funds. Most of the companies have gone under that were in charge of these wells. Yes, I am. I work with Darren. Yeah. So returning to the orphan wells. As a critical creative response to this compounding problem, the Calgary-based artist Alana Bartol established the Orphan Well Adoption Agency, an installation dedicated to finding caretakers for orphan and abandoned wells, or oil and gas wells in Alberta, that had temporary offices at Truck Contemporary Art Gallery in Calgary, Latitude 53 in Edmonton, and the Art Gallery of Grand Prairie over the course of 2017. So you could go in and fill out a form to adopt one of the existing abandoned wells. Creative efforts like those of the Orphan Well Adoption Agency, which make kin of abandoned infrastructures, and critical theoretical efforts from those like Beckett and Keeling's provide grounds through which to reclaim reclamation. And so I'm going to end here, this is my sort of revisiting of questions of reclamation, which has been more or less a side interest to some of the work that I've been doing over the past few years. But I use this talk as a way to create space to go back to some of these kind of questions that I had in sort of critical trajectories related to reclamation. Is this question of how to reclaim reclamation. That's sort of my impulse that I get from reading this kind of very excellent work that's putting kind of more questions of care forward and kind of a sort of expanding the concept of reclamation. So moving forward with my work on reclamation, which I'm primarily doing with a colleague and friend of mine that studies the cultural politics of coal mine reclamation in Appalachia. So he's studying coal mine reclamation and I'm studying oil sands reclamation. And we're both sort of critiquing the limits of actually existing forms of reclamation while arguing for the necessity of first seeing reclamation landscapes as a cultural form that often perpetuate social and ecological injustice in the bounds of the technological register through which it is currently employed, but also recognizing that post-extractive landscapes are also a site of possibility where the afterlives of extractive landscapes can be critically reimagined and remediated in equitable ways. So that's sort of the trajectory that's kind of been opened up in my returning to this. So where I might have been more extremely critical of the concept of reclamation in the first place in that piece that I assigned, I'm starting to kind of think through the possibilities of what reclaiming the concept of reclamation looks like. So that's my contribution.
So thank you, Jordan, very much. What I really like about your presentation, but I think it heavily links to Michelle, is the way that it makes us think about time, but also what are the discourses? So when we're visualizing Industry 4.0, what are the discourses that we're encouraging or not encouraging? What are the kind of fantasies or imaginaries, even in our own data visualizations that we're creating around these extraction industries? And also this question about, about futurity and temporality, that there's a time to the processes we're depicting. How do we introduce temporality into both the research studio's work and more broadly as you're thinking about projective designs about the future? How you know, kind of introducing and thinking about the kind of critical discourses that you've heard here.
Thank you, all of you. It's a wonderful discussion, and I want to invite you, but I don't know. So the final review of the studio is going to be divided in 2 mornings, April 20th and 21st. So I can send you a link, and you are absolutely welcome. It would be fantastic to have your input. It's going to be in French. But the students, most of the students actually are quite at ease with English. So, and the work is visual. So that's the nice thing about architects. They visualize things. So,
yeah, you're. It's not mandatory at all, but obviously, it's an important part of.
Not also it has to be for free. We don't remunerate this sort of performance. This is master studio, and it's, if you are interested, if you want, just let me know. I send you the links.
Yeah, just to engage in the actual pedagogy, the architecture and design studio, which is, you've already done so much, because it's actually really important, obviously, to have this sort of perspective. We'll also obviously hopefully stay all in touch about the broader outside project